Welcome to the AI Adoption Podcast. I'm your host, Professor Ashley Braganza, and my guest for this episode is Lord Tim Clement-Jones. Tim was made a CBE for Political Services in 1988, and in 1998 he was made a life peer. Tim is the Liberal Democrats' spokesperson in the House of Lords for Science, Innovation and Technology. Last year, Tim published a book entitled Living with the Algorithm. In this book, he raises the question, is mankind destined to be AI's master or servant? And he addresses this question through the lenses of AI governance and policies for the future. Tim has made significant contributions to the development of AI over the years, both nationally and internationally. Here are just some highlights. Tim is the former chair of two House of Lords select committees, one on artificial intelligence and the other on AI weapon systems. Tim is the co-founder and co-chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for AI. Tim co-founded the OECD's Parliamentary Group on AI. Tim serves as a consultant on AI policy and regulations for the international law firm DLA Piper. And Tim chairs a number of committees and sits on various boards, including the Authors Licensing and Collections Society, the Trust Alliance Group, and Queen Mary University London's Council. I think listeners will agree that with such an incredible background, Tim brings huge thought leadership to the issues around AI adoption. Tim, welcome to the AI Adoption Podcast. It gives me great pleasure to have you as the inaugural speaker on the podcast. I've given the audience a little bit of background about you. I wondered if you could say a little bit about what brought you to the area of AI, please.
Well, hello, Ashley. It's a great pleasure to be on your podcast. You've described how I got involved in AI, and the what is really what I'm now, concerned with, which is all about AI risks and opportunities, and whether or not we should regulate, how, if we do regulate, we should, and also the whole international dimension of AI, the movement towards artificial general intelligence. There are so many questions to be asked, and I'm sure that you're going to ask most of them this morning.
You're right, absolutely right. So, look, let's get stuck in. Matt Clifford's report looking at AI adoption, he mentions the word adoption 26 times, and he makes it very clear that in his view anyway, the public sector can lead the way in AI adoption. And I know that in your book, Living with the Algorithm, you've dedicated a whole chapter to AI adoption in the public sector. I guess my question is, to what extent do you think the UK's public sector is prepared for planning and implementing AI?
Well, that's a really good question, because we've been debating that fairly heavily in the Data Use and Access Bill, in terms particularly of data itself, but that forms a very core part of AI adoption. And I'm afraid the public sector is not yet there in terms of its culture. And it is particularly about culture rather than anything else. And what worries me is that there is this movement to join up data right across the public sector. There's a great enthusiasm, particularly by our Secretary of State for Science, Innovation and Technology, for adoption in the public sector. But first of all, we don't really have the culture in terms of privacy, protecting, in terms of transparency about the use of AI. I push back quite heavily on the fact that all the government seem to rely on is having an algorithmic transparency recording standard. They haven't really thought about the other aspects of greater transparency towards the citizen, in terms of how decisions are made, what decisions are made, the ability to challenge them, and so on, which I think is very important. But also, do we have the leadership? It's very easy, and this is a gospel that I preach, I'm afraid, in the private sector as well as the public sector, is do we have the leadership in the public sector who really understand what this is all about, who understand the need to work out whether it's going to augment employment in the public sector or substitute for it, what is it designed
Mm.
to do, and so on. So there are a lot of imponderables about use of this, and I'm a great AI enthusiast, but one of the reasons I'm an AI enthusiast is that I believe that actually a good framework, a good regulatory framework, is going to help us adopt it. And I think that applies to both the public and the private sector.
I would agree, Tim. And one of the things that you've mentioned is around data and how important data is to the adoption of AI. I just wondered, what do you think might be done to overcome some of the fragmentation of data in the public sector? Because different departments have their own data silos, their own data islands. What can be done to kind of ensure that the data is at the right level of quality for use in AI technologies?
Yes, it is all about the quality, but it's all about the reassurance and the trust that the public hold in it. Because, as we saw when there was the opt-out from GP sharing of data, 3.5 million patients opted out. Now, that means that in a way, your data is going to be skewed because it's not as universal as it could be. And the same is true of other forms of public sector data. You want representative samples. You want it joining up and cross-referencing, but you also need to make sure that this isn't seen as some kind of surveillance state at the same time. And I don't see a great deal of reassurance being given currently. We've had various statements about the need to create trust and so on. But, the appointment of very large American companies, otherwise known for their presence in the defense sector, is not necessarily going to create public trust when they're the ones who are putting the whole shebang together in the public sector. So, I don't think we're focusing nearly enough on what will make this whole thing work, whether it's the actual interoperability of the data or the public trust that is necessary to get buy-in from the public to sharing it.
And this issue of trust is clearly central to the adoption of AI, particularly trust, that members of the public place in the institutions that they have to transact with. I guess that you mentioned again this issue of culture. What do you think needs to happen in the public sector that to create a culture whereby trust is seen and to be taken perhaps more seriously and elevated as a really important aspect of what the public sector need to do?
Well, I think that's a very shrewd point, a very shrewd question. And it's all about leadership. Again, you keep coming back to the fact that the heads of our department, the permanent secretaries, the senior people within each department, they're the ones who need to grasp this. They can't just simply say, oh, it's the chief technical officer or the chief information officer or somebody down in the boiler room who's responsible for adopting AI and making sure that there's proper communication about its use. And they have got to make sure that they understand this fully and that they are making sure that the governance of the use of AI within their departments and across government, if they have that responsibility, is ethical, safe, and so on. And, I do stress the ethics because an awful lot of emphasis historically over the last couple of years has been on safety. Well, it's not just about safety, it's about fairness and transparency and accountability. As well as safety, or indeed the latest word which is now in use in the AI Security Institute, security. It's much wider than that. And I think what we have to do is revisit why we all signed up to the OECD principles, which are ethical principles. They're not just about safety.
And this issue about signing up to international principles and being part of that international movement, do you think the UK is keeping up with the developments that are taking place internationally?
I don't actually. I think that our promise to legislate, well, first of all, it's very delayed, but what is being promised, certainly in the Labour manifesto and subsequently by ministers, is some sort of translation of the Bletchley Park Declaration for generative AI models into legislation. Well, I don't think that's sufficient, frankly. It's about the right government to inspect and so on and so forth. But AI is much, much broader than that. And then we find that in terms of the Paris, we signed up very happily because we were the hosts at Bletchley. We signed up in South Korea, but we didn't sign up to the Paris Declaration.
Hmm.
Which is the most recent one in February. Now, that is completely unaccountable. It refers to responsible and ethical AI, and the government should have had absolutely no reason for not signing up to that. So I'm afraid I'm rather doubtful about whether we're doing nearly enough in this space. And I could talk about the kinds of things that we do need to do, and others in Parliament are also concerned about this, and we're very impatient to see what the government's going to propose.
Well, I mean, if AI adoption is going to happen, and if the government is going to see the AI action plan through, I guess it's not just the public sector that needs to adopt AI. Increasingly, it's the private sector that needs to also adopt AI. And given your what you've just said, how do you, in from your vantage point, how do you see the regulatory landscape evolving into the future?
Well, I see one or two rays of light bursting through. I was very interested, and you've referred to Matt Clifford's report, the AI Opportunities Plan, which is going to take shape, and I think that was a very positive aspect with its 50 recommendations. A couple of them in terms of copyright are not so welcome, but most of the rest is. And he, in that report, says well-designed and implemented regulation alongside effective assurance tools can fuel fast, wide, and safe development and adoption of AI. And I very much agree with that. So I hope if Matt has some influence on government, that we will see ourselves with a broader form of regulation. And because at the moment, the assumption is that it's sector by sector, but we need some sort of overarching duty in terms of risk assessment. It doesn't have to be very, very heavy in terms of adoption of international standards for things like continuous monitoring, testing, training, and so on. And if we did that, we would find ourselves a haven for those who want to develop with certainty around the kinds of regulation internationally that would get you through being able to exploit it in almost every territory. The worry at the moment is that if you develop things without having any guardrails, you find yourselves up against it if you try and adopt it or exploit it in the EU. You may find yourself up against state laws in America. You'll certainly start finding yourself up against laws in other parts of the world like Korea and Australia. So, we have to find a way of making sure that we regulate, but in a way that is interoperable with the rest of the world.
Uh, I guess every time people hear the word regulation, they think red tape. And it's almost as though regulation is a counterpoint to innovation. And there is in my view anyway, a kind of implicit assumption that if you bring in regulation, by definition, you are dampening innovation. And I just wondered, if if there was a counterpoint to the arguments that you've just raised, it's, well, if you bring in all this regulation, Tim, you're going to kill innovation. How do you square that circle?
Well, I'm a great believer in consistency, certainty, and convergence. And the more we can converge our regulation, the more consistent and certain we can be, the more I think business will appreciate that. And even SMEs want a form of certainty. They may not want too much red tape. And, that's where sandboxing comes in. We invented sandboxing in this country to make sure that our regulators didn't come down heavy where experimentation was taking place. And I think, that is an absolutely vital component of any form of regulation. And it gets you through this sort of early stage slightly existential worry about the weight of regulation. Once you've seen how your new application, your new model is working out, and how you can conform to regulation, then you can start exploiting it. But you don't have to bear the full weight of the wrath of the regulator while you're developing it. And that's a really important opt-out of all of this. And, other jurisdictions have adopted our sandbox culture. So, again, what's not to like about this? And I'm a firm believer that regulation is not the enemy of innovation. It's actually, done properly, it's the friend, because it does create that certainty for business. They know they're not going to be caught out at a future time coming down the track.
Yes, and I guess a key part of ensuring that there is a regulatory framework, and again, something that you mentioned a little earlier, is around making sure that AI and those companies that provide services based on AI technologies behave in an ethical way. And as I read your book, you use a phrase which caught my attention, which is ethics-oriented governance and regulation. And I just wondered, Tim, if you could unpack that for our listeners. What do you mean by ethics-oriented governance and regulation, please?
Well, it's strangely something that derives from our original AI Select Committee. And shortly after our report came out, and we recommended that there should be an ethical underpinning of the way that AI was going to be developed and adopted in the UK. We didn't go at that time as far as saying we needed it enshrined in legislation. But strangely enough, very shortly afterwards, the OECD came out with a set of principles which were not unlike set of ethical principles, and the G20 agreed with those, which were not unlike the ones we originally came up with. And they are basically values, principles that lay out what the governance of AI should be now and in the future, and whether it's predictive AI or generative AI, whatever it may be. And it's a set of human values because in all of this, I'm pro-human in the face of the machine. I think we have to promote human values, but it's things like fairness, safeguards against potential harm, accountability, transparency. It's all those things that are life enhancing, human value enhancing. And it's not just about safety, because I never quite understand when people talk about safety, what do they mean? Of course, I'm very keen on online safety with social media platforms to prevent that sort of harm. But I think it's very easy just to talk about AI in terms of safety rather than the ethical underpinning, which is what is going to make sure that our human values and the value of work, for instance, for humans persists.
Yes, and that overlap between, or the interplay between ethics and regulation, I think are really important, because you cannot regulate for bad behavior. God knows there are many laws that have been passed over the years and people still behave badly. And so ethics is about back to the culture and the leadership of the organization to ensure that no matter what the regulation is, you behave in an ethical way. You shouldn't need a law to tell you that if you're doing something bad, you shouldn't do it. But
Absolutely.
but equally, Tim, it seems to me that the big tech companies, if they're doing anything, they seem to be arguing for lower regulations and lower regulatory requirements. Um, I mean, are countries, the UK being one, really capable of standing up against some of these big tech companies, many of whom own the data? And are those tech companies really going to want to put profit before regulation and ethical behavior?
Well, many of them talk a good game. And I know the origins of some of the companies like OpenAI and Anthropic, had public benefit at its core. And so you've got to keep reminding them of their original purpose. But I agree, inevitably, we know with shareholders who are big tech companies themselves, the Googles, Microsofts, Amazons of this world, they're going to be profit driven. But we have to, as a sovereign country, make sure that we're able to, A, insist on certain forms of regulation, but B, we make expectations of the companies, the businesses that adopt AI in our own country. And corporate governance, even if it's not always underpinned by regulation, is really important. So that's why I emphasize corporate responsibility and leadership, as well as regulation, because I don't believe that, exactly as you say, you can't regulate for everything. You've got to basically try and make sure that you've got a gold standard of corporate governance that applies, and that good companies are well respected, are admired by consumers, and so on and so forth. Now, that may sound a bit pie in the sky, but that's what we have to strive for. And, that's why, you see all sorts of codes of practice being brought in. You see people like the CBI promoting this sort of thing. And you've got to have a company buy into this. And that means the balance with regulation has to be quite carefully thought through.
If we think about that balance of regulation and think about it particularly in terms of the private sector, what do you think the government and policymakers can do to encourage boards to actually start to address some of the concerns and to kind of work towards seeking the benefits from AI through adoption? What do you think could be done to encourage faster rates of adoption of AI, do you think?
Yes, I mean the bigger companies are already in pretty, doing quite well, and there's clearly, quite a lot of understanding of the benefits of AI, what it can do for productivity, and so on. But actually encouraging the ethical adoption is one thing, and I think you have to stay on the case. You have to start introducing regulation of one kind or another, and say, look, this is the first step, and we expect you to do more to go beyond this. And we will go beyond it if we don't see decent behaviour. SMEs, which you may come on to in a minute,
Hmm.
are a different kettle of fish, because I think there's a fear of missing out in the bigger companies, and sometimes they don't quite know what they're doing, but they are trying, and they have to make sure that their boards of directors and PLCs and so on increasingly understand what they're doing and take responsibility. SMEs, I think, are in a much more difficult position, partly because of the lack of regulation, but partly just lack of skills, lack of understanding what the potential is, lack of access to, if you like, standardized AI tools and so on. And, I'd be the British Chamber of Commerce, chaired by Martha Lane Fox, recommended last year a national AI champion.
Hmm.
Well, I would go there, but strangely enough, what I would do is get the British Chambers of Commerce to actually have an AI champion themselves and get our SMEs geared up. Now, unlike continental Europe, we don't have a statutory chambers of commerce, but I think it would give our chambers of commerce, a wonderful lift actually to be given some grant money by government to get out there and engage with SMEs on the adoption of new technology like AI. And I can't think of anybody better to spearhead that actually than Martha in those circumstances.
Mm, thank you. Um, Perhaps I could have her on the podcast at some point. Uh,
I definitely would get her because, like her, we're both, in terms of the skills out there in the female workforce. the dial has not moved in AI development and adoption since 2018. About 20% of the workforce is female, and at a recent debate, we both thought this was just completely unacceptable.
Yes. And talking about AI in the workforce, I mean, one of the more recent developments is around agentic AI or AI agents. And there's been a long discussion about, humans in the loop, humans on the loop, humans out of the loop. And increasingly with agentic AI, there is every possibility that humans are going to be taken completely out of the loop because the AI agents won't just be processing the data, but they'll be processing the data, taking decisions based on that data, and then passing instructions on to other agents. How do you see this development impacting on the workforce, and how do we ensure, back to something you said a bit earlier, how do we ensure that humans stay part and integral to AI adoption?
Well, it's a mixture. It's partly about skills, making sure that our employees and workers do have the skills needed to work alongside AI tools, AI systems. But it's also about employers making sure that they assess the impact of these tools properly. And one of my concerns is that, for instance, we have a new employment rights bill going through Parliament currently. There's nothing in there requiring, say, for instance, what might be called worker impact assessments. So, boards of directors don't have to worry themselves about how this is going to impact on their employees, whether it's going to substitute, whether it's going to augment. And I think every employer who brings in any form of significant AI model into the workplace needs to understand that. And government also need to understand that this is going to move pretty fast. I mean, we saw how, for instance, the motor car, the automobile, took over from the horse in about 10 years at the beginning of the 20th century. Well, we could be as fast as that with AI, with agentic AI, where it's almost like artificial general intelligence, multimodal, it's autonomous in many respects once you've asked it to do something, and it will mean a huge number of people losing their jobs in the workplace unless we make sure that we are introducing it in an ethical and proportionate way. And at the moment, I don't think government really is on top of that, quite honestly. And, have they really thought about the possibility of some sort of universal basic income coming down the track? I mean, we're not particularly well off as a country, but we may need, in order to keep people in some form of well-being, to adopt something along those lines in future. But, there are a lot of very closed minds out there.
I mean, this opens up a whole vista of further questions, which I may have you back on a further episode, Tim, to explore just in your last response. But let's move on to this issue of the SMEs, because the UK economy is made up of very large numbers of SMEs. And SMEs provide, 70 or so percent of employment in the UK. How do you think SMEs can best prepare for AI?
Oh, that is the most complex, diverse ecosystem you could possibly imagine. And funnily enough, I'm a believer in trade associations. I mean, you can't just leave it, say, to Tech UK to help their, burgeoning tech companies, AI developers, and so on, go out there and sell their wares. I think trade associations have a role in all of this in terms of making sure that there is sort of kite marking, for instance, for certain models, whether it's in retail or, it might be fashion or, you're looking at different sectors, and every sector is going to be, is going to have different AI models that are being sold into that sector. It's bad enough even with a monolithic body like the NHS, where they, picked off trust by trust. There isn't really
Mm.
a proper coherent national procurement system for AI models in the NHS. But I do think that you have to create confidence in the SME sector and also drive down the cost. I mean, one of my concerns is that if you leave it to SMEs to adopt standards and so on, standards cost money,
Yes.
you know, and so you have to make it easy for them. So you have to distinguish between the big companies who can afford bespoke enterprise models and so on, and the smaller players who really you have to treat the micro businesses, you have to treat them more like consumers, where you have to really have kite marking and consumer like reassurance about the kinds of tools that they're adopting. But we're not really grappling with all of that at this moment. And I'm just hoping that with our growth strategy in the UK, this is the sort of thing that will happen. And the AI opportunities plan doesn't quite talks about adoption 26 times, as you say, but it doesn't really grapple with that inherent conservatism of SMEs.
And many of these SMEs, particularly in the current economic situation, are struggling, particularly those on the high street, because I mean, I think everybody is well aware of the troubles facing small and medium-sized businesses that are on our high streets and that have a physical location. Trying to get these companies to invest in AI technologies itself is challenging when they are just about keeping their noses above water. Um, what do you think some of the tech companies and suppliers might be able to do to help SMEs kind of get on board with AI?
I think it's the development of models specifically directed towards the micro businesses, the smaller SMEs, and so on. Um, I'm like a one-person business in politics, basically, but I experiment with AI. That's because I think I understand it and I think I know enough about it to trust it. But that's not the case with so many SMEs. So again, this is an education and skills aspect. Where are the evening sessions promising to help business people in SMEs adopt all of this. You could say that our technical colleges should be doing some of this. We've got the IoTs that were set up under the last government, the Institute of Technologies,
Indeed.
and surely isn't that a role that they could play? I mean, I think we need to kind of brainstorm this a bit, and whether it's DBT or DCIT, they have to basically grab this agenda and run with it.
And Tim, so this podcast is all about AI adoption. From your vantage point again, how do you see AI adoption being taken up across the UK? If I were to ask you to look into your crystal ball and say in 3 years' time, 5 years' time, where would you expect the UK to be in terms of AI adoption?
Oh, well, it's gone incredibly slowly in the SME sector over the last few years, but it's gone very fast in the growth companies and the larger companies. So I think that probably it'll go, it's 25% now, maybe 30. We'll move up to 50 or 60, I think. But there are an awful lot of businesses out there that still aren't making the best use of the data or collecting the
Mhm.
data or using data in any way. It's all still very analog. So the internet took a long time to take off with so many businesses themselves, and yet they've seen and the pandemic sort of accelerated that. Well, there may be some form of event that accelerates AI? I don't know, but I think there's going to be quite a gulf between the fleet-footed AI adopters in the SME sector and those who continue to do things in the way they always have. And they're not going to be that competitive. I mean, what worries me is that we're going to be subject to some very large players, and I think the whole AI developer area is going to consolidate down to 2 or 3, and that's going to really cause competition issues at the end of the day.
Tim, thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing your thoughts with our listeners on AI adoption. I very much appreciate the time and your thoughts on the subject, and I look forward to meeting you again very soon.
Thank you very much, Ashley. It's been a huge pleasure.
Thank you.